This can't be happening. They said you were gone.
You buried the wrong truth, Vivian.
Security! Don't just stand there, stop him!
I knew you were alive.
Today, everyone who betrayed me will answer for what they did.
6 weeks from now, hundreds of people are going to stand in the rain outside a church in Atlanta and watch a dead man walk back into his own funeral. Nobody in that church knows it's coming. Not the widow crying in the front pew. Not the man delivering the eulogy. Not even the daughter sitting 3 rows back, wondering if she made the right choice by staying quiet for 2 months when everything in her wanted to scream the truth from the moment she found it. By the time you finish this story, you'll know exactly why Edmund Calloway ended up in that coffin, who put him there, and why the one person everyone blamed for abandoning him was actually the only one trying to save his life. The rain hits the stained glass of Mount Zion Baptist Church in steady sheets that Tuesday morning, and inside, the pews are packed shoulder to shoulder with men in dark suits and women dabbing at their eyes with tissue that's mostly for show. Vivian Calloway sits in the front row in black, a veil pulled halfway over her face, her hands folded so perfectly in her lap that a woman 2 seats down leans over and whispers to her husband that she's never seen anyone grieve with that much composure. Up at the podium, Preston Vaughn adjusts his glasses and looks out over the crowd like a man who has given 100 speeches and never once meant a word of any of them until today, or so he wants everyone to believe. Edmund Calloway built an empire out of nothing, Preston says, his voice cracking just enough to sound real. And he never once stopped building, right up until the day his heart gave out. A few people nod. Someone in the back blows their nose loud enough to draw a glance. Preston pauses, the kind of pause a man takes when he's about to say something he's rehearsed in a mirror, and he opens his mouth to continue. That's when the doors at the back of the church swing open, and cold air rushes down the aisle like the building itself just took a breath it had been holding. Every head turns at once. The rain is still falling behind him, framing his outline in gray light. And for one full second nobody in that church says a single word, because the man standing in the doorway is wearing the same charcoal suit he was buried in 11 days ago. Edmund Calloway walks down the center aisle of his own funeral like a man walking into a boardroom he built with his bare hands, and the first face he looks for isn't Preston's. It's Vivian's. And what crosses her face in that moment isn't grief. It isn't relief either. For one unguarded second, before she catches herself, it's something closer to fear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Edmund Calloway ended up standing in the doorway of his own funeral, you have to go back 2 months to a version of his life where nobody had any reason to bury him yet. Edmund Calloway grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Perry Homes housing project on the west side of Atlanta, one of 6 kids sharing a bathroom and a hand-me-down bike between them. His mother worked double shifts at a laundry service downtown, and his father wasn't around long enough for young Edmund to remember much beyond the sound of the front door closing. By 19, he was hauling drywall for a construction crew. By 26, he'd bought his first rundown duplex with money he'd saved living on rice and bologna sandwiches for 3 years straight. By 50, Calloway Holdings owned office towers, warehouses, and shipping routes across 4 states, and the boy from Perry Homes had a corner office on the 40th floor with his name etched into the glass. He built all of it standing next to one woman, Ruth Calloway, who he married at 24 in a courthouse ceremony with $11 left in his checking account afterward. Ruth kept the books by hand in the early years, back when Edmund couldn't afford an accountant, and she never once let him believe the money mattered more than the family it was supposed to protect. Their daughter, Naomi, was born in a hospital room Edmund almost missed because he was closing a deal on a strip mall in Decatur, a fact Ruth never let him forget and never quite forgave him for either, not fully, even years later. Ruth died 11 years ago, and the official story, the one that made it into the obituary and the one Edmund told himself every single day since, was that her heart simply stopped one November morning after months of what her doctors called an unexplained decline. She'd been tired for a long time before that, forgetful in ways that didn't fit a woman who used to run 3 companies' worth of numbers in her head. Edmund grieved her the only way he knew how, which was to work harder, build bigger, and avoid looking too closely at the medical file that still sat, unopened past the first page, in the bottom drawer of his study. The argument that split Edmund and Naomi apart 7 years ago happened on a Sunday evening in October, in the same study where so much else in this story would later unfold, and it started, as most devastating arguments do, over something that seemed small enough to survive. Naomi had brought Marcus to dinner for the first time that night, nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous since her nursing boards, watching her father across the table make careful, polite conversation that told her nothing about what he actually thought. It wasn't until after Marcus left, driving back to his apartment in that same 12-year-old Honda that would later become a running joke in Edmund's mind, that her father asked her to stay behind in the study, and she knew from the set of his shoulders exactly what was coming. "He's a good man," Edmund started, which should have been a compliment and somehow wasn't, because of everything that came after it. "But you didn't work this hard, didn't get into that program, didn't build the life you've built, to end up supporting a schoolteacher's salary for the next 40 years. Naomi remembers standing very still when he said that, feeling something in her chest go cold in a way she hadn't expected from her own father, of all people. "I make my own salary," she said. "I'm not marrying him for his." "That's not the point," Edmund said, and Naomi would spend years afterward turning that exact phrase over in her mind, because it was the first time she understood that her father genuinely believed there was a version of love that could be measured in the same terms as a business deal, and that he expected her to understand it the same way. He told her, that night, about a man he'd already spoken with, a young attorney at a firm Calloway Holdings used regularly, someone Edmund described as ambitious in the way Edmund respected, someone who understood what building a life at their level actually required. Naomi laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, and when she realized it wasn't, when she understood that her father had been quietly arranging introductions to men he considered suitable while she'd been falling in love with someone else entirely, something broke open in her that had been building for years without her fully naming it. "You've never once asked me what I want," she said. "You've spent my whole life deciding what I should want and calling it love." Edmund, cornered by an accusation he wasn't prepared for, did what he always did when he felt control slipping, which was push harder rather than listen. "I've given you everything," he said. "The least you owe me is not throwing it away on a man who'll never be able to give you the life you were raised in." That sentence, more than anything else said that night, was the one Naomi carried with her out the door and didn't come back from for 7 years. Not the introduction to the attorney, not even the dismissal of Marcus specifically, but the word, "oh." The idea that love from her father had always come with an invoice attached, one she was only now being asked to settle. She married Marcus 8 months later in a small ceremony neither of her parents attended, Ruth already gone by then, and Edmund choosing, out of pride he'd later recognize as the same pride that nearly got him killed, not to show up to a wedding he considered a mistake in progress. The years that followed weren't dramatic in the way the argument itself had been. There were no more fights, because fights require contact, and contact was the one thing neither of them offered the other. Naomi built a life in East Point that had nothing borrowed from her father's world, working double shifts at Grady Memorial the same way her grandmother once worked double shifts at a laundry service, though she never let herself draw that comparison out loud. Marcus taught 7th grade social studies at a public school 12 minutes from their house, coached the boys' basketball team in the spring, and never once, in all the years Naomi knew him, asked her a single question about her father's money. Edmund, for his part, filled the silence with work the way he'd always filled every silence in his life, closing bigger deals, expanding into markets Calloway Holdings had never touched before, and telling himself, on the nights it got hardest to believe, that Naomi's absence was her choice to make and not something he needed to examine his own part in. It was Corinne, more than anyone, who watched him carry that particular weight over the years, noticing the small things nobody else in that house seemed to track, the way he'd pause sometimes at a photo of Naomi as a child still displayed in the hallway, the way his jaw would tighten whenever her name came up in casual conversation with business associates who didn't know better than to ask. In the years since Ruth's death, Edmund remarried. Vivian came into his life at a charity gala, laughing at exactly the right moments, asking exactly the right questions about his work, and within 18 months, she was his wife. She was 33 to his 55, and the gossip columns had a field day with it, though Edmund told anyone who asked that Vivian understood him in a way nobody had since Ruth. His oldest friend, Preston Vaughn, had handled Edmund's legal affairs for 30 years by then, ever since the two of them met at a real estate closing where Preston was the only lawyer willing to work for a percentage instead of a fee. Edmund trusted Preston with everything, his contracts, his will, his secrets, and it never once occurred to him to wonder what 30 years of quiet devotion might actually be owed in return. Which brings us to 2 months before that funeral, to an ordinary Tuesday morning, when Edmund Calloway woke up with his hands shaking so badly he couldn't button his own shirt, and told himself it was nothing more than getting older. Corinne Bassett had worked inside the Calloway estate for 22 years by then, long enough to know the exact rhythm of a house before something inside it goes wrong. She'd started as a part-time housekeeper back when Ruth was still alive, and the family lived in a house half the size of the Buckhead estate Edmund built later, and she stayed through every renovation, every new wife, every silence that stretched a little longer than the one before it. Corinne didn't say much. She'd learned a long time ago that the people who talk the least in a house like that are usually the ones who see the most, and she'd rather watch quietly than be the person who spoke too soon and got shown the door for it. What she noticed first wasn't the shaking hands, because Edmund hid those well enough behind closed study doors and long sleeves, even in July. What she noticed was the tea. For as long as Corinne had worked there, one of the kitchen staff brought Edmund his afternoon tea on a tray at exactly 4 o'clock, the same brand, the same honey, same as it had been since Ruth used to make it herself. Sometime around February, Preston started bringing it up personally instead, telling the kitchen staff not to bother, that he was heading up to the study anyway to go over paperwork with Edmund. Corinne noticed because Preston had never once in 30 years cared what time anyone's tea went up, and now he made a point of it nearly every single afternoon. She mentioned it once, carefully, the way she mentioned most things to Edmund, standing in the doorway of his study with her hands folded in front of her apron. "Mr. Vaughn's been awful generous with your tea lately," she said, and left just enough space after it for Edmund to ask what she meant. He didn't ask. He looked up from a stack of papers, said something about Preston just being thoughtful in his old age, and went back to work. Corinne closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway a moment longer than she needed to, the way a person does when they've said the only piece of a warning they know how to say out loud, and it landed on deaf ears anyway. It was 2 days after that conversation when Edmund found the inconsistency himself, though at the time he didn't understand what he was looking at. Preston had brought over a routine amendment to one of the shipping subsidiary contracts, the kind of document Edmund used to read line by line back when he was younger and hungrier, and now mostly skimmed and signed on Preston's word alone. Something about the wording caught him this time. A clause about transferring signing authority that didn't match what the two of them had discussed on the phone a week earlier. Edmund read it twice, then a third time, and told himself he was misremembering the conversation, that 30 years of trust didn't get undone by one paragraph that felt slightly off. He signed it anyway. He just didn't sleep well that night. That was the same week he started locking his study door before bed, a habit he'd never had in this house, in this marriage, in this life. He couldn't have told you exactly why if you'd asked him. It wasn't fear yet, not something he'd have named out loud. It was closer to the feeling of walking into a room you've walked into 1,000 times and sensing, without being able to point to a single thing that changed, that the air in it is different now. Vivian noticed the locked door too, though she said nothing about it directly. What she said instead, over dinner one evening in early March, was that Edmund had been looking tired lately, that maybe it was time he thought seriously about stepping back from the day-to-day at Calloway Holdings and letting the board handle more of the operational load. She said it gently, the way a wife says something out of love, resting her hand over his on the table, and Edmund found himself agreeing that maybe she was right. Maybe he had been pushing too hard for a man his age. He didn't notice, or didn't let himself notice, how quickly that conversation turned into a second one 2 weeks later, and then a third, each one edging him a little further from the decisions he used to make alone. Naomi, 3 miles away in a modest brick house in East Point, was noticing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with tea trays or locked doors, and everything to do with a phone call her father made to her in early March, the first one in almost 7 years. Edmund almost didn't make that call at all. He'd picked up his phone 4 separate times over 2 days, scrolled to Naomi's name, and set the phone back down each time, telling himself it wasn't the right moment, that he needed to think through what he wanted to say first. The truth was simpler than that. He was scared, in a way he hadn't let himself be scared in years, and the only person whose voice he wanted to hear was the one person he'd spent 7 years too proud to call. When Naomi's phone rang that Tuesday evening, and she saw her father's name on the screen, her stomach dropped before she even answered it. 7 years of silence doesn't end with good news, not in her experience, and she picked up already bracing herself for whatever it was. "Daddy," she said, and there was a pause on the other end long enough that she almost asked if he was still there. "I just wanted to hear your voice," Edmund finally said, and something about how small he sounded, how unlike himself, made Naomi's chest tighten in a way she wasn't prepared for. She should have asked him what was wrong. Later, she'd replay this exact moment 100 times and wish she had. Instead, 7 years of hurt rose up faster than her instincts could stop it, and she heard herself say, "Is that supposed to fix everything now?" Edmund went quiet again, and in that silence Naomi felt the old argument rushing back, the one in his study, the words he'd said about Marcus, about her throwing her life away. "I have to go," she said, before he could answer, and she hung up the phone with her hand shaking, sat down at her kitchen table, and cried in a way she hadn't cried since the night she left his house for good. When he finally drove out to the estate the next morning, he asked Edmund to meet him alone, no assistance, no Vivian, in the study with the door shut. Edmund read the results without saying a word for almost a full minute, then set the folder down on his desk with a steadiness that surprised even Dr. Reyes, the kind of stillness a man reaches only after his body has already been telling him the truth for weeks, and his mind is finally catching up to it. "Someone's been doing this to me," Edmund said, not as a question. Dr. Reyes nodded, and then, carefully, told him the rest of what he'd found buried in the old records Edmund had asked him to pull for comparison. The pattern in Edmund's blood work matched almost exactly what little documentation existed from Ruth's final months, the labs nobody had thought to run further tests on back then, because grief moves faster than suspicion, and nobody in that house had been looking for a killer 11 years ago. Edmund sat with that for a long time after Dr. Reyes left. Whoever poisoned Ruth had never been caught, had likely never even been suspected, and had apparently decided, over a decade later, that it was worth trying again. He thought of every person who'd had access to his home in both those years. Preston had been in his life the whole time. So had Corinne, though something in Edmund refused to let his mind rest there for more than a second. Vivian hadn't come along until years after Ruth's death, which should have cleared her, except Edmund found himself wondering. In a way, he hated himself for wondering whether she'd simply learned from whoever came before her. He didn't tell Vivian what Dr. Reyes had found. He told himself it was strategy, that he needed to understand who he was dealing with before he showed his hand. But underneath that reasoning sat something rawer, a fear he wouldn't name even to himself, that saying it out loud to her and watching her face might confirm the very thing he couldn't yet bring himself to believe. Vivian, unaware that Edmund now knew anything at all, kept moving forward with what she'd already set in motion weeks earlier. That Thursday, she called an informal meeting with 3 of the senior board members at Calloway Holdings, framing it as nothing more than a concerned wife looking out for her husband's health. "He's been so worn down lately," she told them, her voice pitched just soft enough to sound like worry rather than ambition. "I think it's time we talk seriously about transitioning more operational authority to the executive committee, just until he's back to himself." 2 of the 3 board members nodded along without much resistance. Preston, sitting at the head of the table, said almost nothing during the meeting, only adding at the end that he'd support whatever arrangement protected Edmund's well-being, a phrase he'd clearly chosen with some care. By the following Monday, a formal proposal had been drafted, one that would shift majority signing authority on all major contracts to a 3-person committee for the next 6 months, citing Edmund's health as the reason. It landed on Edmund's desk with Preston's cover note attached, describing it as a formality, nothing that would change how things actually ran day to day. Edmund read it twice, the same way he'd read the shipping contract months earlier, and this time he didn't sign it right away. He set it aside, told Preston he wanted a few more days to think it over, and watched something flicker across his oldest friend's face that he might have called irritation if he'd let himself look at it directly. That night, alone in his study with the door locked, Edmund opened the bottom drawer of his desk for the first time in 11 years and finally read Ruth's old medical file all the way through. The file was thinner than he remembered, just under 20 pages, most of it routine lab work from Ruth's final 8 months that Edmund had never once opened past the first page, not because he lacked the time, but because grief had made him afraid of what looking too closely might tell him about all the months he hadn't been paying attention. Reading it now, with Dr. Reyes's warnings still fresh in his mind, the pattern was almost impossible to miss. Ruth's iron levels had swung erratically for months before her death, flagged twice by lab technicians as unusual, with a handwritten note from her physician at the time suggesting a follow-up that, as far as Edmund could tell, never happened. Her doctor back then had been recommended to the family by Preston, a detail Edmund had forgotten entirely until this exact moment, sitting alone in a locked room reading his dead wife's chart 11 years too late. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with the file open on his desk until nearly 4 in the morning, running through every possibility his mind could produce and hating almost all of them. If Preston had done this to Ruth, and was doing it again now, then 30 years of friendship had been built on something Edmund couldn't begin to make sense of. If it was Vivian, working alone or alongside Preston, then the marriage he'd believed in for 8 years had been a performance from the very first charity gala where they met. And underneath both of those possibilities sat a third thought he kept trying to push away and couldn't, that he had no way of knowing who else in that house might already be involved, or how long he had before whoever was doing this decided slow wasn't fast enough anymore. He called Dr. Reyes back to the estate the following afternoon, and this time he didn't ask for treatment options. He asked a different question entirely, one that made Dr. Reyes go very still in his chair. "If people believed I was already dead," Edmund said, "would they stop?" Dr. Reyes started to argue against it immediately, listing every reason it was reckless, illegal, and likely to fall apart under any real scrutiny. Edmund let him finish, then asked the question that actually mattered. "If I confront them now, with what we have, what happens to me in the next 30 days? Dr. Reyes didn't have a good answer to that one, because the truth was, without an arrest and hard evidence, Edmund confronting his own poisoners directly meant handing them a reason to finish the job faster and cover their tracks better. Over the next several days, in conversations that took place only inside that locked study, the two of them built a plan neither of them fully believed would work until it started coming together piece by piece. Dr. Reyes would document a sudden cardiac event, consistent enough with Edmund's actual declining blood work that no attending physician would think to question it. A closed casket, citing Edmund's own wishes, drafted and notarized weeks earlier under the explanation that he simply didn't want to be remembered lying in state. A private arrangement with a funeral home run by a man Dr. Reyes had known for 15 years, discreet enough not to ask questions he didn't want answered. Edmund would disappear to a property 2 hours outside the city that nobody but Dr. Reyes knew he owned, purchased years earlier under a shell company for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with wanting one place in the world nobody could find him. The hardest part of the plan wasn't the paperwork or the funeral home. It was the question Edmund turned over more than any other in those final nights, whether to call Naomi and tell her the truth before any of it happened. He picked up the phone twice. Both times, he set it back down, telling himself a reason that sounded, even to him, thinner each time he said it. If she already believed he was dead, truly believed it, he would finally know whether the daughter who'd cut him off 7 years ago still carried any love for him at all, or whether that door had closed for good the night she walked out of his study. It wasn't strategy. It was a scared, prideful man testing the one relationship he'd already broken once, using his own staged death as the test. He didn't let himself consider, not fully, what that same test would do to a daughter who had no idea her father was safe, and even less idea that she already knew more about what was happening to him than he did. 11 days later, Edmund Calloway was pronounced dead of a sudden cardiac event in his Buckhead estate, and the funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 3 days after that call where Naomi hung up on her father, unable to shake the way his voice had sounded, she drove to the medical records office at Grady Memorial, the hospital where Ruth had spent her final months, and requested her mother's full chart under her legal right as next of kin. It took 2 visits and a signed form before the request cleared, and when the file finally landed in her hands, she sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before she could bring herself to open it, the same way her father would sit with that same file weeks later in his own study, though neither of them knew yet that they were retracing the same 11-year-old ground. What Naomi found confirmed the fear she'd been carrying since that phone call. The lab patterns matched almost exactly what she'd seen in patients back at her own hospital who'd presented with slow heavy metal exposure. Cases rare enough that most nurses went a whole career without seeing one, but common enough in her specific unit that she recognized the signature immediately. She didn't call her father. She told herself, the same way he was telling himself in his own study 3 miles away, that she needed proof before she said anything, that showing up with nothing but suspicion would get her dismissed the way she'd been dismissed in that same house 7 years earlier. The truer reason sat underneath that one. She was terrified that if she was wrong about who was responsible, or if she tipped her hand too early, whoever had done this to her mother would simply finish what they started with her father before she could stop them. She started small. A former classmate from nursing school now worked in toxicology at a private lab downtown, and Naomi asked her, carefully, without explaining why, whether she could run a comparison between 2 sets of anonymized results. The classmate agreed, mostly out of old friendship, and confirmed within a week what Naomi already suspected. The exposure pattern in the newer sample, one Naomi had obtained by asking Marcus to casually mention to a mutual acquaintance at the estate that Edmund's water delivery service seemed worth switching, testing a bottle from his kitchen that made its way to her through a chain of favors Edmund never knew existed, matched Ruth's old records closely enough that it wasn't a coincidence anymore. What she needed next was access, and access was the one thing 7 years of estrangement had taken from her completely. She couldn't walk into that house and start asking questions without someone noticing, and she couldn't go to the police with nothing more than 2 lab comparisons and a decade-old grief nobody had ever investigated the first time. So she did the only thing she could think to do, which was watch from a distance, the way she'd learned to watch symptoms and patients who couldn't yet tell her what was wrong, and wait for something concrete enough to act on. That something arrived on a Thursday afternoon, when Marcus came home from a parent-teacher conference and mentioned, almost in passing, a name one of the other teachers had brought up, a woman whose brother-in-law worked at a pharmacy that had handled a large private account for the Calloway household for years. Naomi drove to that pharmacy the next morning on her day off, and after 20 minutes of careful, roundabout conversation with a pharmacist who remembered her mother fondly from years of filling her prescriptions, she learned that the account had been managed, from the very beginning, by one person who called in every renewal personally and always paid by a separate account rather than insurance. Preston Vaughn's name was on that account, and had been for over a decade. Naomi sat in her car outside that pharmacy for a long time after that conversation, staring at nothing, feeling something break open in her chest that was equal parts vindication and horror. Preston had been in her family's life since before she could remember, had walked her down a hallway at her mother's funeral with his hand on her shoulder, had sat across from her at a dozen holiday dinners telling stories about Edmund's early years like a man who genuinely loved his oldest friend. She had no proof yet that he'd done anything more than manage a pharmacy account, nothing that would hold up anywhere that mattered. But she knew, the way she'd known about her mother's chart the moment she opened it, that she was looking at the shape of something true. She was 3 days into trying to figure out her next move, still turning over how to get real evidence without exposing herself to whoever was watching that house. When Marcus came into the kitchen holding his phone with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, and told her that Edmund Calloway had died of a heart attack the night before, Naomi didn't cry at first. She sat very still at the kitchen table, running through every version of what this might mean, and none of them made sense against everything she'd just spent weeks confirming. If Preston or Vivian had finally succeeded, then whatever they'd done had happened faster than her own investigation could keep pace with, and every piece of caution she'd exercised over the last several weeks had cost her father his life. It was only later that night, alone in the bathroom with the water running so Marcus wouldn't hear her, that the grief finally caught up to her. Not for the estrangement, not for the 7 years of silence, but for the version of her father she'd never gotten to have back, the one she'd been quietly working to save without him ever knowing she was trying. She almost didn't go to the funeral. Every instinct she had told her that whoever killed her father would be standing in that church accepting condolences, and she wasn't sure she could sit in a room with them and stay silent. But something else pulled her there too. Something that had nothing to do with proof or suspicion, a need to say goodbye to a man she'd spent 7 years too proud to forgive, in whatever form that goodbye was allowed to take now that it was too late for any other kind. What Naomi didn't know, sitting in that church 3 rows back from Vivian's perfectly composed grief, was that the man she was mourning wasn't dead at all, and that within minutes, the truth she'd spent weeks building alone in silence was about to collide, in front of every person who mattered, with a truth her father had been hiding from everyone, including her. For 11 days, Vivian Calloway had rehearsed exactly how she would carry herself through this funeral, and for 11 days, every rehearsal had gone according to plan. Now, standing halfway between the front pew and the aisle where her husband is walking toward her very much alive, none of it holds. Her hand goes to her chest, not out of shock at seeing him breathe, people would say later, but out of something closer to a woman watching a plan come apart in real time. Preston freezes at the podium mid-sentence, his mouth still open around a word he never finishes, and the eulogy he spent so long perfecting hangs unfinished in the air of a church gone completely silent except for the rain still falling outside. Edmund stops at the end of the aisle, close enough now that Vivian can see he isn't confused, isn't disoriented, isn't a man returned from some medical miracle. He's watching her the way he used to watch a competitor across a negotiating table, patient and unreadable, and it's that stillness more than anything that finally cracks her composure. "Edmund," she says, and her voice comes out smaller than she intends, nothing like the voice she used with the board 3 weeks earlier. He doesn't answer her directly. He looks past her instead, toward the front pew, until his eyes land on Naomi, 3 rows back, sitting perfectly still with both hands pressed flat against her knees like she's holding herself in place by force. Naomi doesn't move for a long moment either. Later she'll say it felt like her body needed proof before it would let her feel anything. And the proof came slowly, in the small details that couldn't be faked, the exact way he holds his shoulders, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a construction accident decades earlier, catching the light from the stained glass. When it finally lands, when some deep, cautious part of her finally accepts that her father is standing there breathing, she doesn't sob or cry out the way half the church expects her to. She stands up, slow and deliberate, and says the only thing that matters in that moment, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I know what they did to you." The words land like a second shock wave through the church, harder in some ways than Edmund's entrance itself. Preston's hand tightens on the edge of the podium. Vivian turns toward Naomi with an expression that, for the first time all morning, looks genuinely afraid rather than performed. Edmund turns too, searching his daughter's face for an explanation he doesn't yet have, because as far as he knew walking into that church, Naomi was still the daughter who hadn't spoken to him in 7 years, who'd hung up on him weeks earlier without a word of concern. "I know about Mom," Naomi says, her voice steadier now, carrying through a church that has gone completely, uncomfortably still. "I know the same thing that was done to her was being done to you. I've had the lab results for 2 weeks. She looks past her father then, directly at Preston, and something in her expression makes the older man take an actual step backward from the podium. A small, involuntary movement that several people in that church will later swear told them everything before another word was said. "I know about the pharmacy account too," Naomi adds, quieter now, but no less clear. "The one you've been managing personally since before she died." Edmund turns to look at Preston fully for the first time since walking through those doors, and whatever composure he'd carried down that aisle starts to slip for the first time. 30 years of friendship compress into a handful of seconds. Every holiday dinner, every late-night phone call, every deal Preston helped him close, standing on the other side of a truth Edmund still doesn't fully want to believe. "Tell me she's wrong," Edmund says, and his voice, for the first time in this entire story, sounds like an old man's voice, tired in a way none of his health scares had made him sound. Preston doesn't answer. He looks instead toward Vivian, and that single glance, brief as it is, tells the church everything the two of them had spent months trying to hide. What happens next unfolds faster than anyone expected grief to turn into evidence. Dr. Reyes, sitting quietly in a back pew where almost no one had noticed him, stands and makes his way forward, a folder in his hand that he'd been carrying since Edmund first walked through those doors. The same folder that started this entire chain of events weeks earlier in a locked study. He hands it not to Edmund, but to Naomi, a small gesture that tells its own story about who he trusts more in this moment. And Naomi opens it in front of the church, reading aloud the toxicology comparison her father never knew existed, matching almost exactly the numbers she'd already gathered on her own from an entirely different direction. Vivian is the first to move toward the doors, her heels loud against the church floor in a silence that makes every step audible. But 2 men near the back, cousins of a board member who'd grown suspicious of the transition proposal weeks earlier, and come to the funeral half expecting something to feel wrong, step into her path before she reaches them. Preston doesn't try to run at all. He sinks back down into the front pew instead, the same pew where Vivian had been sitting minutes earlier, and puts his head in his hands, the posture of a man who has spent 30 years building toward this exact collapse without ever quite believing it would come. It's Edmund who finally speaks the question that's been sitting underneath this entire story since Ruth's death 11 years earlier, his voice carrying across a church that has stopped pretending to grieve and started, instead, to witness. 30 years, Preston, he says. Why? Preston sat with his head in his hands for a long moment before he found the words, and when he finally lifted his face to look at Edmund, whatever performance he'd carried through 30 years of friendship had nothing left to hide behind. You built an empire with my name nowhere on it, he said, his voice flat in a way none of them had ever heard from him before, stripped of the courtroom warmth he'd used for 3 decades. I drafted every contract. I structured every deal that kept you out of prison twice in the 80s when you cut corners nobody talks about anymore. I stood next to you at every milestone, and every single time, it was Calloway Holdings, never Vaughn and Calloway, never even a partnership on paper. He said it like a man reciting a grievance he'd rehearsed alone for years, in rooms nobody else ever saw. Edmund stared at him, searching for the friend he thought he'd known, and found instead a stranger who'd apparently been keeping a ledger of resentment since before Naomi was even born. So you poisoned my wife, Edmund said, each word landing separately, like he needed to hear himself say it before he could believe it. Preston flinched at that, the first real crack in his composure. That was never supposed to go as far as it did, he said, and something in the way he said it made Naomi's stomach turn, because it wasn't a denial, it was an explanation, the kind of thing a man says when he wants credit for restraint he never actually showed. I only wanted her weak enough that you'd finally listen to reason about restructuring the company. I didn't expect her system to react the way it did. The church stayed dead silent through this, the kind of silence that comes when several hundred people realize they're watching something far more real than the funeral they arrived for. Vivian, still held at the edge of the aisle by the 2 men who'd stopped her, said nothing at all, her earlier composure completely gone now, replaced by the look of a woman calculating exactly how much of this was about to fall on her specifically. Preston glanced at her once, and in that glance, something unspoken passed between them, an old understanding neither of them had planned on surviving past today. And me? Edmund asked. Was I supposed to react the way I did too, or did you get better at this since Ruth? Preston didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Naomi stepped forward instead, closing the distance between herself and Preston until she was standing almost exactly where he'd stood at the podium minutes earlier delivering a eulogy for a man who wasn't dead. You held my shoulder at my mother's funeral, she said, her voice shaking now for the first time since she'd stood up in that pew. Not with fear, but with something closer to fury finally breaking through years of careful control. You told me stories about her at every holiday for 11 years. You let me grieve her without ever once telling me the truth I deserved to know. Preston had no answer for that either. What came instead, within minutes, was the sound of sirens outside the church, because one of the board members' cousins near the back had already called it in the moment Dr. Reyes handed that folder to Naomi, sensing exactly what kind of mourning this was turning into before most of the room had caught up. 2 officers came through the same doors Edmund had walked through alive less than 20 minutes earlier, and the sight of them moving down that same aisle, this time toward Preston and Vivian rather than away from a coffin, was the image that would end up circulating on local news by that evening, though none of them standing in that church yet knew how quickly this story would spread beyond its walls. Vivian didn't resist when the officers reached her, though she did turn back once, looking at Edmund with an expression that seemed to be searching for something, sympathy maybe, or at least acknowledgement of the 8 years she'd spent building a life next to him. Edmund gave her nothing. He'd already turned away from her by then, walking the last few steps down the aisle toward his daughter, closing a distance that had taken 7 years and a staged death to finally cross. He stopped in front of Naomi and didn't say anything for a moment, the two of them standing close enough to touch, but neither one closing that last small gap yet. "You knew," he finally said, "and you didn't tell me." It wasn't an accusation. It came out more like disbelief. The words of a man trying to understand how his daughter had been quietly working to save his life, while he sat in his study, assuming her silence meant she'd stopped caring entirely. "I was scared that if I told you, and I was wrong about who it was, they'd know I was close," Naomi said. "I was trying to get you proof before I lost you the same way I lost Mom." Her voice cracked on the last word, and it was that crack, more than anything said in the entire confrontation, that finally broke through whatever composure Edmund had left. "I didn't call you before I disappeared because I wanted to know if you'd still grieve me," he said, the admission coming out rough, unpracticed, nothing like the calculated stillness he'd walked down that aisle with. "That was cruel of me. I know that now. You'd already spent weeks trying to save me, and I put you through losing me again anyway, out of my own pride." Naomi didn't answer right away. She stood there letting the weight of that land, 7 years of hurt and 2 months of secret fear, finally meeting in the middle of a church that had gone from funeral to confession to something neither word fully captured. "I forgave you a long time ago," she finally said. "I just didn't know how to say it without you hearing it as permission to keep doing things the same way." Edmund nodded slowly, and for the first time in this entire story, reached for his daughter the way he should have reached for her 7 years earlier, before pride and control and 30 years of misplaced trust in the wrong man cost him almost everything that actually mattered. Marcus, who'd been standing quietly near the back of the church through the entire confrontation, watching his wife do something braver than either of them had expected this morning to require, finally made his way forward once Edmund's arms were around Naomi. Edmund looked up at him over his daughter's shoulder, and for the first time since the day he'd told Naomi she was throwing her life away on this exact man, something like recognition passed across his face, an acknowledgement 7 years overdue. The charges came fast once the story broke, faster than anyone standing in that church that morning could have predicted. Preston Vaughn was booked within 72 hours on charges that included attempted murder against Edmund, and once the exhumation order came through 3 weeks later, a second charge tied directly to Ruth's death 11 years earlier, something the district attorney's office had never once considered until Naomi's lab comparisons and Dr. Reyes's original toxicology folder landed on a detective's desk together. Vivian's charges took longer to settle, prosecutors working to untangle exactly how much she'd known versus how much she'd simply allowed to happen around her. But the financial records Preston had kept meticulously for 30 years, the same records that once protected Edmund, ended up being the ones that buried them both. Corinne Bassett got the acknowledgement she'd never asked for and never expected, when Edmund sat her down in the same study where she'd once mentioned, carefully, that Preston had gotten awfully generous with the tea. "You tried to tell me," he said, and Corinne, 22 years into working for a family that rarely said things like that to her directly, allowed herself a small, tired smile and told him some things take longer to hear than others. He gave her a role afterward that had nothing to do with housekeeping, overseeing the estate's operations with a salary and title that reflected what she'd actually been doing unnoticed for over 2 decades, the closest thing to justice available to a woman who'd spent that long paying attention when almost no one else had. Edmund rewrote his will within the month, this time with a different attorney entirely, someone Naomi recommended from her own life rather than anyone tied to his old circle. Naomi and Marcus were named not as afterthoughts managed by a trust, but as equal partners in decisions about the company's future, a distinction Edmund insisted on personally, telling the new attorney he'd spent 7 years treating his daughter's choices as mistakes to be corrected and he didn't intend to spend whatever years he had left making that same error again. Marcus, for his part, wanted almost nothing to do with Calloway Holdings itself, content to keep teaching. But he accepted Edmund's invitation to sit on the family foundation's board, a small gesture that meant more to both men than either said out loud. That foundation became the clearest marker of everything that changed. Edmund used a portion of the settlement recovered from Preston's decades of quiet embezzlement to establish a scholarship in Ruth's name for nursing students at Grady Memorial, the same hospital where Naomi had once sat in a parking garage forcing herself to open her mother's old chart. He asked Naomi to help design the program herself, and she did, weaving into it a mentorship structure aimed specifically at students from backgrounds like the one she'd grown up in, before wealth had ever entered the family's life at all. On a quiet Sunday morning some months later, Edmund and Naomi drove out together to the cemetery where Ruth was buried, the first time either of them had gone there together since the funeral itself. Edmund stood at the foot of the grave for a long while before he spoke, telling Ruth, and telling Naomi standing beside him, the truth he'd never let himself say out loud in 11 years. That he should have opened that file the week she died instead of the week he almost died too. That his own fear of what he might find had cost both of them more than either deserved to lose. Naomi didn't try to comfort him out of that guilt. She simply stood beside him, letting the weight of it settle the way grief settles when it's finally allowed to be honest instead of managed. At the ribbon cutting for the scholarship program that following spring, Edmund stood toward the back of a small crowd gathered outside Grady Memorial, watching Naomi at the podium instead of standing at it himself, something he would never have allowed a year earlier. He watched the way she spoke about her mother, about the students who'd walked through this program without ever knowing the full story behind its funding, and he found himself thinking that this was the first thing he'd built in decades that he didn't need his name carved into anywhere for it to matter to him. 6 weeks after the funeral that started this whole story, a man walked back into a church very much alive, and everyone in that room believed, for one full moment, that they were watching something impossible. What they were actually watching, though nobody standing there could have named it yet, was the end of 30 years of a lie built on quiet resentment, and the beginning of a family finally choosing honesty over the version of loyalty that almost cost them everything.